Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, El Salvador is now in the third month of a state of exception. That's a package of emergency laws aimed at tackling gang violence. But while the government believes it is bringing gangs under control, human rights groups say innocent people are being targeted by police. We look at how the state of exception is changing El Salvador. Helping us unpack the current state of the state of exception, we have Tamara, Daniel, Tiziano. So good to have all of you here on the stream. Tamara, please introduce yourself. Tell our audience who you are, what you do.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Tamara Tarasiuk. I'm the America's Acting Director at Human Rights Watch.
Daniel, great to have you on the stream. Please introduce yourself to our stream audience.
Hi, I'm Daniel Alvarenga, and I'm an independent journalist of Salvadoran heritage.
Good to have you. And Tiziano, welcome to the stream. Please introduce yourself to our international audience.
Good to see you again, Femi. Thanks for having me in good company with Daniel and Tamara. I'm Tiziano Breda, Central America analyst at International Crisis Group.
All right, looking forward to your analysis. All right, do you have analysis? Do you have questions, comments for our lineup? You're very welcome to be part of today's show. Put your thoughts into the comment section and then join the discussion. Daniel, I'm just looking at a few of Al Jazeera's headlines from earlier on this year, from springtime in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm looking at El Salvador declares state of emergency after gang killings. That was in March. And then, more recently, surging gang killings spurs fear, uncertainty in El Salvador. One more headline, El Salvador extends state of emergency amid gang crackdown. You have been reporting on gangs in El Salvador for so many years. Did you know that once the president has said we are going to go to war with gangs, we are cracking down, that this was inevitable, this was going to happen?
Yes, because President Nayib Bukele has always pursued a militaristic plan. He one time stormed Congress in February 2020 when he first started as president. He stormed Congress asking for them to, increase the military budget because he has always wanted to sort of use the gang war as an excuse to militarize the country. And, the gang war is not new. It didn't start with Nayib Bukele. It has been many presidents before him have tried to tackle this problem and have also tried to do a gang war. So he's not doing anything quite original. It's part of Salvadoran politics. Gangs and violence are unfortunate part of life in El Salvador. It is a big issue, but the way he is going about it is causing a lot of concern. A lot of human rights abuses are being alleged, and yeah, it is concerning for a lot of us who are Salvadorans who have family back in El Salvador. We're a transnational people, and so what happens in El Salvador has a direct effect out here because that's a lot of the migration waves have been because of this gang violence for decades.
Tiziano, I'm just wondering if you could summarize some of these emergency measures that have been in place temporarily since March.
Well, thanks, Femi. I'm actually, if I can just jump in on Daniel's comments.
Please.
I think definitely the law enforcement bit of the Bukele security policy, which was enshrined in a plan that was really never known to the public, which is called Territorial Control Plan, was an important one. But it is actually true, and I think we should recognize that there's also a part of this policy, which is based on community intervention, the building of so-called cubes, which are basically laser centers for to give space for the youngster in marginalized communities to train, to learn, to play. And so there's been a double, phase that the government has been using in that regard. And adding to the fact that in parallel, as investigations, as we basically in 2020 still already had warned or that this could be ongoing, and then El Faro found out with more evidence there were conversations with the gangs going on to negotiate basically the reduction of homicides. And that's actually what led apparently to these spiking killings in March with 87 people killed in a span of 3 days, when the average was like 1 or 2 per day. and which led the government to respond with this clampdown, which includes, as you were asking, the temporary detentions time from 72 to be extended from 72 hours to 15 days, the suspension of the right to legal defense, basically, to the freedom of assembly, and was accompanied also by legal reforms to increase the sentences for belonging to gangs, trying underage people as adults, and introducing also sort of a gag law against any media who spread any sort of gang-originated message which creates anxiety.
All right. Tamara, I'm just looking at the Twitter feed of El Presidente, and that's President Bukele. I'm using Google Translate, so if this doesn't quite translate and you speak Spanish, apologies for that. But this is what the president was saying just a few months ago. Message to the gangs: because of your actions, now your homeboys won't be able to see a ray of sunshine. I am wondering this impact of cracking down on the gangs, having emergency laws, what has that done to the people of El Salvador? Are they now safer than they were a few months ago?
Look, what I would say is that violence brings more violence. And what we're seeing with this state of emergency and the way it's been implemented is that the government has used these excessive laws. I would add, Tiziana talked about underage. We have here now laws that allow authorities to go after kids as young as 12 years old, which is an important detail. But, when implementing these laws, what the authorities have done is detain more than 30,000 people. They just detained them on the streets, in their houses. They took them arbitrarily, arresting them, in many cases showing as evidence that they had tattoos. That is clearly not the basis of a thorough criminal investigation. So you really don't know who they're rounding up. And our research, together with local groups, shows that they're rounding up innocent people. They're being arbitrarily detained. They're being subjected to short-term detentions that amount to short-term enforced disappearances, because the last time they are seen, it's when they are taken by authorities, and then you see mothers, sisters, waiting, trying to get information about the whereabouts of their loved ones outside detention centers, and they deny the whereabouts. And then the other very, very difficult issue that we've been documenting is deaths in custody. People who get to hospitals with signs of being beaten, coming from areas where they were subject to government authorities like prisons, and then they die in very delicate circumstances. So, what we are seeing is an abusive implementation of the laws that Tiziana was talking about, in clear violation of human rights of Salvadorans. Although I have to say, and this is something we do need to talk about, that despite all of what we have been saying, Bukele remains tremendously popular.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Tiziana, if I may, I'm just going to jump in just for a moment, because I want to show our audience scenes of what it is like for some of the families outside of detention centres. So I'm going to bring in Elizabeth and Ophelia, and they can tell their own stories. Have a listen, have a look.
It's painful because I don't sleep and I don't eat knowing that my son is suffering. Look, they are making a mess in here. They don't say anything. They don't say anything on television. They don't publish anything in the newspapers. Yesterday when I came, we saw a guy released from prison whose forehead was all beaten.
Here we sleep, lying on the floor, suffering for our family. We love my husband and we want to have him in our house. We don't want him to be suffering. We suffer, and he suffers.
You can see that line of families just standing outside of detention centres waiting. Earlier we spoke to Michael Parberg. He's Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Virginia Commonwealth University. And this is what he told us about those detention centres. And then I'm going to let Tiziana come right back into the conversation. Here's Michael.
Locking up tens of thousands of low-level and often imaginary criminals gives the illusion of law and order and is popular with the public. But effectively, all this does is it overstuffs the prisons, which were already at 200 to 400% capacity and controlled by the gangs. This only strengthens the gangs and leads to more gang violence, which in turn justifies the government's heavy-handed approach in a vicious circle of decreasing security and increasing authoritarianism. The Civic National Police of El Salvador has improbably estimated the number of people tied to gangs to be 500,000, which effectively means that any young man in El Salvador is subject to indiscriminate arrest.
Tiziana, go ahead.
Precisely. Well, I think Michael raised very good points. And also, Tamara, I think it's very concerning to look at the increasing amount of deaths in jails, because they're a direct product of this mass incarceration. When you double up the prison population, just imagine 2% of the adult population in El Salvador is now being locked up, So 1 every 50 people, basically. And if you mix up, as you, Tamara was rightly mentioning, people with no membership, basically no relationship with gangs, but just on the suspicion that they might be with gangs, you mix up them with active gang members, current one, because many of them are being rounded up. It must not be ruled out. And former gang members, people who had desisted, left the gang life, even years ago. Some of them erasing their tattoos or crossing them, which is basically a death sentence on their necks by the same former peers of the gangs. And you put them in the same jails. We don't know if in the same cells, because the information, jails are becoming a black box, not only for relatives, but for overall national and international agencies trying to look at this issue. Well, the risk that this creates, sparks mutinies or targeted killings is enormous.
Daniel, what can you tell us about conditions in prisons and detention centers now?
So El Salvador is, a product of U.S. intervention. Since the Civil War, U.S. intervention, U.S. politics has shaped El Salvador. El Salvador is the country after the United States with the most incarcerated population. And it just makes no sense in terms of solving the actual issue. I also think it's important to talk about the rhetoric that he is, saying. He's calling these innocent kids, a lot of them are kids, terrorists. He said, this is the head of Congress, Ernesto Castro, has called this gang war an all-out fight against terrorists. So he's using this very divisive language. But back to your point on the jails, they're very inhumane conditions. President Bukele has gone on Twitter bragging about the fact that he is rationing or limiting their food. Who knows what goes on there in terms of he could be starving people. There have been deaths already in these jails since the gang sweep. And it's really sad because the average Salvadoran would rather people die in jail that they think are, these boogeymen, these bad people, if it means to keep the homicide rate down. So some people think it's a great trade-off, but he's very much, playing with the fact that he has a big propaganda machine to basically criminalize these people without any due process. And in the public imagination, he's calling them terrorists. He tweeted on May 5th, bragging that more than 25,000 terrorists have been captured at that point. And it's just terrorist doesn't really describe anything. It's sort of just a very loaded term, especially if some of these people haven't even committed crimes other than being, poor and working class. I think a big thing is also that he is going for the poor working class families, racialized people in El Salvador, vulnerable people who may not have someone that can bail them out. As you saw those mothers and wives, outside the jail cell trying to get their family members, they don't have any other recourse but to go outside and protest. And that's not getting coverage because...
to that? Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I think just an important point to complement what you're saying, and I completely agree, is, let's take a step back and look at what is happening in El Salvador and what has happened over the past couple of years since Bukele, because it's not a coincidence that we're talking about the president and his Twitter account, because he's been governing through Twitter. And, he's been able to do that because he's also dismantled at an alarming speed democratic institutions in the country. We were earlier talking about that incident in which he went with the military into the Legislative Assembly, but then, with the majority in the Legislative Assembly, he's been able to adopt laws, replace the Attorney General, dismiss hundreds of lower court judges and prosecutors. And he's doing the work of independent journalists and human rights defenders much harsher and much riskier.
Tamara.
So, you were mentioning that tweet talking about homeboys.
Yeah.
He tweets about us, about Human Rights Watch, calling us homeboys Rights Watch.
Yeah, interesting.
And, I don't live in El Salvador. There are very brave people doing this work, facing enormous challenges, living there every day.
All right, Tamara, I want to put a couple of things to you. Ernesto Castro is the president of El Salvador's Legislative Assembly. He believes that this state of emergency that El Salvador is in right now is going very well. Let's have a listen, let's have a look.
8 of every 10 Salvadorians approve of the state of emergency. And we can say 8 of every 10 Salvadorians perceive the improvement in security within their communities after the insecurity provoked by the gangs, by those terrorist groups.
Tamara, it's going well, according to the government.
Well, look, I think that's what I was mentioning at the beginning when I was saying,
Daniel's laughing. Daniel's laughing right now.
He's extremely popular, and we have to deal with that. And it just makes, the work of highlighting the problems that affects people who are suffering these policies much more important, right? That's the whole point of democracy. It's you have certain limits that you can't trespass, regardless of what the majority says. And, I would ask, let's go and take those 8 people and ask them a question after they took away their child and that person has been locked up and it's an innocent person, right? So, we need to talk about people.
Right.
And it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 2 or hundreds, which is the case in El Salvador. We are receiving hundreds of cases of people who claim their loved ones were, arbitrarily detained.
Okay, so,
it's not 1 or 2 people.
What is going on here, Tiziana? Tiziana, I want to show you something on my laptop. This is the president's official website. Because we did reach out to the president's office, to official sources, to see if they would come on the program, we got a no and no response. But let me show you here, under the category of security, what the information is that they're sharing with the public. 2 months of the emergency regime, authorities have captured more than 5,000 women linked to gangs. Salvadorans perceive a drop in crime after the execution of the territorial control plan and the exception regime. War against gangs carried out by the government exceeds 37,000 captured. Salvadorans feel safer thanks to the measures implemented by the government to dismantle criminal structures. And so it goes on. Lots of positive news about these emergency measures. Tiziana, the government is feeling one thing. You, Danielle, Tamara, are telling me something completely different. Why?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's totally different in the sense that I recognize it's undeniable. I think that the pressure that the government is putting on gangs has made them go into disarray, basically. A lot of gang members are fleeing the country. A lot of gang members have actually been apprehended. A lot of gang members are hiding in the mountains, in the rivers, even in the sewers, some people from local communities told us. This is alleviating somehow the life in some communities who were, of course, subjected to extortion and to the persistent threat of gangs. The problem that we see is that this is temporary. And of course, there's been also a lack of violent response, if you want, from gangs at the moment, with May seeing the least amount, the recorded amount of homicides in the country's recent history over the last 3 decades. There's a caveat there that we would like to raise, which is that gang members or alleged gang members dying in shootouts with the police are not being counted anymore in the death toll, which is extremely concerning in terms of transparency and trying to keep track of the overall figures. But if we sum up, the gang members died in shootouts and the homicides reported, we arrived to around 30 homicides in 1 month.
Okay.
Remember that this country was used to have them like 30 homicides in 1 day a few years ago.
Yeah, amazing.
So there is some achievement in that regard, and this is translated into the public's perception. The problem with that is that this is only temporary, and as we are displaying and flagging, this is going to affect more and more people in an unjust way, and that's something that is just unjustifiable.
Okay, so earlier we spoke to Jennifer, who wanted to share this thought with us. And then, Daniel, I'm going to come to you because we have questions on YouTube that I want you to answer very swiftly if you're able to. Here's Jennifer.
The government is using the pretense of criminality to arbitrarily and indefinitely detain dozens, if not hundreds of individuals, mostly young men. This is causing harm and damage to communities already affected by violence and instability. It is putting human rights defenders, mostly women, at risk, as it is the human rights defenders and women who are holding vigils outside detention centers, seeking information about detained loved ones and demanding due process. This is causing irreparable damage and harm. It is increasing fear. It is increasing violence. It is not producing peace and security.
Daniel, I'm going to fire some YouTube comments at you. Answer them as quickly as you can. Abshir says, what are the benefits of these new laws? You can be honest. Go ahead, Daniel. Go ahead.
It's hard to know what the benefits are of these new laws because President Bukele is not being transparent. He's not transparent with this whole Bitcoin law where he's trying to gentrify the country for tech bros. He hasn't been transparent about the gang problem because he hasn't even extradited, gang members that the U.S. have labeled actual terrorists. So it's really hard just to, it's really hard to take their word for it and to really, we'll see the long-term effects in years to come once we study what's actually going on, but it's hard to tell.
So this may be related because one of our viewers wants you to talk about how much has crime been reduced. Tiziano kind of touched on this. There seem to be fewer homicides than there were a few months ago. Daniel?
I mean, just like you said, the transparency thing, they're not counting certain types of crimes that the police commits. This is, the police have all kinds of immunity. We don't know what kind of crimes they're committing. They're obviously committed human rights abuses in these jails, but we can't just take the government's word on it. They don't even give interviews to the press. And as you all reached out, they didn't respond kindly to that. So, yeah, it's almost a wait and see. Like, the official narrative is one thing, but Salvadorans will live with the consequences for years to come.
I want to go to one more voice and bring Erica into the conversation because what she points to is, so what should be the policy to address gang violence in El Salvador? This is what Erica has to say. And then, guests, I'd like your very swift response. Here's Erica.
In June 2019, a few weeks after he took office, I personally met with President Bukele. He committed to bring human rights to the center of his policies. 3 years later, he has broken his promises. With the excuse of punishing gang members, President Bukele's administration is creating a perfect storm without addressing the root causes of violence. Marginalized communities are now stuck between the violence created by criminal gangs and the human rights abuses committed by the authorities. We are calling on President Bukele's government to stop human rights violations and to address a comprehensive policy, security policy that protect the human rights of people in El Salvador.
If you had a suggestion for what that policy should look like, Tiziano, in a sentence, what would it be for El Salvador?
Rehabilitation and reintegration. You have dozens, at least thousands, if possibly dozens of thousands of gang members who have been in jail and who have been in, in and out gangs for years and years that really want to live the gang life. But they're not given any possibility. There's no rehabilitation law for the government. They will always remain a gang member, and their past will haunt them back for the rest of their lives. This is not going to solve the gang issue, but just actually creating the contrary effect or pushing these people who want out back into the gang, grip.
All right. Daniel, I'm in the last 30 seconds of this show. As somebody whose family is from El Salvador, what would your family want in a sentence?
the children. It's all about the children. Like, they need programs, social programs, so they don't go down this path. But it's all going towards military. It's all going towards Bitcoin. The children are sort of missing out, and they're the future of El Salvador, and they're being targeted as 12-year-olds.
Okay. Daniel, Tiziano, Tamara, YouTube commenters, thanks for being part of today's show. Appreciate you.